Hey crafters, thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to make a fun Halloween card featuring products from Lavinia stamps. Hope you enjoy. So to start this card, I used a piece of paper that's 5 by 7 inches, and I started by putting some ink into the corners. So I used the Blue Lagoon Elements ink and then added some lime punch underneath. And I wanted to pick a few colors that were quite different so they would stand out. So I added some paprika ink underneath that lime punch. Now I just focused the ink blending on the corner, and I used the top right corner here. And then when I was finished blending the ink, I turned it over and repeated it on the other corner so that I just have ink in the top right and the bottom left corners. Now once I was happy with the ink, I made sure it was completely dry and used my heat tool. And then I used some clear sticky ink and inked up my first image. So this is the fairy web from Lavinia Stamps, and I stamped it in both of the corners right over the inked areas. So I wanted these colors to really stand out against the background, which we'll do in a moment. So that's why I used colors that normally don't go together on a color wheel. But of course you could change this to any colors that you prefer. So once I finished stamping both corners, I used some clear embossing powder and put this over both of the fairy webs. And then once I had finished with that, I heat set these with my heat tool. I prefer to do my heat embossing from behind the paper, and that way the embossing powder doesn't go flying and I get a nice crisp image when I'm done. So once these fairy webs were completely melted, I used some Nocturne ink and completely covered over the areas where I have the embossing powder. Now you can start to see how neat this effect is, but as you continue adding ink over the other fairy web and then onto the rest of the background, it really comes to life, and that rainbow fairy web really stands out. So once I finished adding the ink all over the background, I'm just going to use a little paper towel and wipe off those fairy webs, and any ink that's stuck on top of those stamps will come off, and as you can see, it brightens up the images so they really pop on the background. And then just to make sure this is completely dry, I'm going to use my heat tool and just dry all over the VersaFine ink. And I'm being careful not to get too much heat on those fairy webs. Now using some dies, these are the Henry's ABCs from Lawn Fawn, I'm going to add a sentiment onto the front. So I'm just lining up the letters to spell Happy Halloween. Now of course you could use any dies for this sentiment, but I love how these dies from Lawn Fawn are kind of narrow, and they lend themselves well to this sentiment. Now because Happy Halloween repeats some of the letters, I had to die cut it in stages. So I just used some Post-it note tape to keep the dies in place, ran it through my die cutting machine, and then lined up the letters again. Now if you find this method of die cutting directly into the background a little bit too fussy, I do show another option later on in the video, which you'll probably prefer. But for this one, I just kept going back and forth until I'd spelt out Happy Halloween. And I ended up having to squeeze the letters together quite a bit, but in the end, I'm really happy with the result here. So once that's all die cut, I'm going to add some of the bugs from Lavinia Stamps, and I'm going to put the spiders around the letters. So I used some Nocturne ink again. and I stamped the spider that's dangling twice with this ink. And then I also added the creeping spider. Now this ink takes a little bit longer to dry, so I thought that while the ink was still wet, I could use some clear embossing powder over these spiders, and that really helped to make them stand out because they are black on black ink. So once I'd covered these with a clear embossing powder, I just needed to make sure there was no excess powder. So I used a paintbrush to brush any of that away. And then again, I used my heat tool so that the embossing powder was set. Now for those two spiders that are dangling, I used a black pen and just drew in a few cobwebs so they were dangling down. I didn't bother with the creeping spider. Now I put some iridescent cardstock behind this panel, and I just wanted to make sure that it would stay put. So I used double-sided tape along the background, and then I also added some PVA white glue as well so that it was nice and secure. And then once this was stuck on, I trimmed off any excess of that iridescent paper so that there wasn't any peeking through on the sides. And then I used a little bit of glue and just glued in the inside of the letters, like the P's and the O. Now you could always stop the card here if you like, but I had this idea for adding some slime onto a card, and I thought Halloween would be a perfect opportunity to try this out. So what I did is I combined some of my lime punch ink and I just put it on my craft mat, and then used some white glue that would dry clear. This one is from Hobbycraft, but I'm sure any white glue that dries clear would work for this technique. And I just mixed it together with a spatula. Now the color that you get here is quite bright compared to the finished color, which you'll see later on. But you do see the lime punch ink come through. So once this is all combined, I'm just going to hold my card on a slight angle and then use my spatula to apply the glue so that it drips down over the sentiment and the stamped images. And I'm just wiping it off so that the glue stays on the front of the card and doesn't fall down behind the card. Now I used quite a lot of glue on this card. The other one I'll show you later on. I didn't use quite as much, but you can decide how much slime you like. Now the good thing about this one is that the slime actually drips down between the letters, and you can of course decide where you want the slime to go by manipulating it like I am with this spatula. Now I left this to dry for a few minutes, and then when I came back to it, I realized that the slime was kind of going the wrong way over one of the letters. So I just went back in with the spatula and just redirected the slime so that it was falling in a more natural angle. And I added a bit more on the side here where I'd missed that area, and then just filled in some other areas. And you can see where the glue is already starting to dry, it's clear, and where it's darker, it's quite thick. Now, once I was completely happy with this, I made sure it was flat and then left it to dry overnight. And you get this incredible dripping slime. Now, if you're not a fan of die cutting directly into the background, you could always do the slime first, like I did on this card, and then just die cut some letters and add them on top. So I've just run these die cut letters through my sticker making machine so that they're slightly tacky. And I'm just lining up the sentiment where I want it to go, and then using a ruler to make sure it's straight. And then once I'm happy with it, I can push the letters down so that they are permanently adhered in place. Now in this one, I put the spiders in a slightly different spot, but you still get quite an effective card. Now for both cards, I did the same stamping inside. I stamped the fairy web stamp in Morning Mist and then one of the spiders in VersaFine Nocturne. And as I mentioned before, these are both 5x7-inch cards. And then once I'd finished that, I just used some double-sided tape to adhere the background onto the card blank. And I just love how that slime adds a bit of a creepy texture to these Halloween cards. Just gorgeous. And you can see both variations here with more or less slime, whichever one you prefer. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this video inspiring. If you'd like to watch another Halloween card video, please click here. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Have a crafty day!